You're going to be able to access real-time index subnet data via Covalent's unified API. And we're going to talk about that with their head of DevRel, Harish. He's here with us right now. Let's bring him in from Covalent. There he is. Welcome, my friend. Thank you so much for being on the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. I still have the music in my head right now, so I thought we would just jam for the hour, and I'd be perfectly okay with that.
Oh, man. Well, I would have kept going, but, we'll do some at the tail end. One of our things is I always get a request from our guests, so I'm going to put that out there now because we're going to do some music at the tail end of the show, too. But it's great to have you on the show, man. You are the head of DevRel at Covalent, like I said, and, of course, we just entered into a cool partnership. I wonder if we could take it back a little bit and start with like how you got into crypto and kind of like your background and how you got connected with Covalent.
Yeah. So I've been in the crypto space since sort of late 2017. And it was kind of by accident I stumbled into this space. I was just randomly perusing YouTube like most people do in the evenings, and came across a presentation by Vitalik, actually. I think it was the very first or second DevCon. And I watched this going, what is this? And then that led me down the rabbit hole. And the next thing I knew, I'd sort of left my day job, and I started with a crypto startup. And it was more focused on the mining element, running rigs and whatnot.
Sure.
And before I knew it, I was running one of the largest rigs in sort of the area that I'm in just the Greater Vancouver area up here in Canada.
Nice.
And it was wild. There was one point where I believe I was working with a Ukrainian, a Colombian, and a Russian, and I was basically sending hash power to a power broker, which was then sending it to a customer. And I remember told my partner at this time what I was doing, and she was like, I don't think we can be together. I don't think you're going to make it till the end of this year. So it was just, indicative of what this environment was like at the time. It was just completely like the Wild West. Not to say that it's a little bit more structured now, but there's still obviously open elements of it still being a little unregulated. But it was just crazy. And then I was hooked. And then spent a couple of years with a startup, a different startup, and then I met the current co-founder Ganesh Swami actually at a blockchain event, and we spoke, and I just kept in touch with him. And then literally, kid you not, 2 years later, I was just going through my LinkedIn to see who I hadn't spoken with for a while. And I saw the last message from him being a couple of years ago. This was in late 2020. And sort of reached out. DeFi summer had just kicked off, and things were getting a little crazy in that space with Uniswap. And I just reached out saying, "Hey, how are you doing? What's going on with your startup?" And you mentioned you just raised a little bit of seed round, and it was growing the team. There were 2 for about 3 years, and they were just starting to grow. And I said, "Sure, let's can I chat and see what we can do?" And a week later, I was starting there. So it's just kind of indicative of just the serendipitous nature of this space. Little small things like that, and all of a sudden, I've been here for almost 3 years, and the team's now up to 45, and we're just growing, and of course have this exciting integration with Dexalot to talk about. So never know where these just random moments of just reaching out can lead people.
Dude, I just love stories of cool people doing cool stuff, coming together to build even more cool stuff, right? I feel like Covalent is one of those creations, if you will. And you guys have been around quite a while now. How many years has Covalent been around for?
Yeah, we're actually a product of a hackathon in sort of late 2017. And that was the genesis of it. And of course, it was like, okay, let's just take on-chain data and throw it into a database, and let's see, where that could lead. And that was basically the very first iteration of the product. And so, 5.5, 6 years later, it's obviously a lot more comprehensive. There's more tooling, more products, more interfaces for developers to leverage. But the bare, core element of what Covalent is, it's basically that. It's structured data served up through, a unified API and also through a business intelligence tool that we'll talk a little bit about as well. So, yeah, the fundamentals. The thinking was, SQL and databases has been around forever. They'll continue to be around. Everybody needs data. And it was an area that the founder sort of doubled down on, pretty early. And, you look at large, databases like the Avalanche ecosystem, Ethereum, Polygon. There's an element of, scale at a certain point. Like if you wanted to index Ethereum now, it'll take you a while. That database is massive. And so, having started at the time that they did, it just kind of inherently means that we were able to start with a smaller database and just continue to grow it. Whereas somebody else sort of entering that space right now would probably encounter some challenges in terms of scale to be able to do that effectively.
Amazing. It was literally going to be my first question, and you already answered it. You touched on this. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about what kinds of data is available? So obviously, just sort of drawing from my pre-crypto experience, one of the biggest challenges in the firms that I worked at in Web 2 has almost always been, the data not being unified, in complete different formats, in complete different protocols, only available at completely different locations, whether it's geographical locations or different servers or different hardware and whatnot. And, inevitably, the companies that actually unified these things always succeeded, right? Eventually, exchanges and TradFi got on board. All the data was unified across one protocol, one type of data. And, the fact that Covalent has been doing this in crypto, in Web3 since 2017 is amazing. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about the types of data that are available? Obviously, you already talked about transactional data, but what else can a user get from you guys?
Yeah, first time, I think you kind of nailed the problem on the head there. Like it's, because these are open systems, they're permissionless. Anyone can write to blockchains. At least the ecosystems we're talking about, basically means that any data that the human being can kind of creatively come up with can exist on these distributed platforms. And so being able to serve up this data and then be able to access and analyze it in sort of a consistent manner, it's a giant mess. Like, there are a few standards, like you'll see things like token standards, but in general, you can literally write any customizable program through a smart contract onto one of these networks. And so the vision that the early co-founders had at Covalent was, well, this is probably going to be a giant mess, sooner or later. And the way to mitigate that and make the experience for developers as optimal as possible is let's try to use and leverage unified schema so that when you're accessing data for Dexalot or for Avalanche C chain or for any of the other subnets or Ethereum or Polygon or any of these other ecosystems, at least the data that you're fetching and the way you set up your request, the shapes are consistent, which means that it doesn't matter if I'm pulling wallet balances, transactions, NFT data, DEX data, swaps, trades, any of the interesting DeFi protocols that you interact with. All that data is structured in a very consistent manner across all the chains that we support. And we actually just pushed past 150 supported networks, which is kind of crazy to think about it. But the pathway with all these, roll-ups and subnets coming out is that, we're actually targeting to be at almost 300 chains by the end of the year and at 1,000 by the end of next year with the way the growth is taking place. So imagine if that data is just completely all over the place as a developer trying to access, or even an analyst trying to access it and trying to understand it, just a giant mess. And so that's really the pain point that Covalent sort of stepped in to try to solve, to make that a unified schema across all chains and make it as simple and easy as possible for developers to access that.
And just so I understand, is your target customer like businesses usually, or do you actually have use cases for retail users as well? Just so our audience has a good understanding of this as well.
Yeah, great question. So in general, with the unified API, which is, again, just one interface to access this data, it's been predominantly businesses. So we've got, wallet projects, taxation tools, investor dashboards, NFT galleries. Those are all examples of business use cases that leverage our API. But from the retail perspective, if you are an analyst and you've got a little bit of experience, maybe writing some SQL or even just using like Power BI or any of these business intelligence tools, you can actually just use our tooling and pull that data directly into that platform, and then build your charts and reports and trend lines and all the conventional stuff that you're accustomed to directly in those tools. And so it caters to both the developer audience, and that's sort of the bread and butter with the unified API. But we also have tooling for analysts, and we actually ran a pretty successful data alchemist bootcamp. We run it twice actually. And I think we're planning to run this dedicated with the Avalanche community. And so the idea is that over a 4-week period, we basically teach you as an analyst to be able to understand how to create things like reach, retention, revenue charts for not only an individual chain, but look at those trends across multiple chains in a very sort of dynamic environment.
Very, very cool. I think I was a guest speaker at one point for some part of the boot camp maybe a couple months back. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But going back to the data components, like you mentioned a lot of different types of data, and I'm going to put you on the spot just a little. Can you tell us a couple of examples of some cool NFT data insights that you've seen in data? And again, the reason why I ask you these questions specifically, we have never asked questions like this to other guests, is that in your position, you have all of the network's data and you have the ability to sort of see it from the top down. What are some like cool NFT insights that you see, or some cool token information that you see that you think is cool for people to hear?
Yeah, the problem is the definition of cool from a data nerd's perspective is probably not.
Got any cool stuff for us? Cool. Where's all the cool stuff?
Let's hear cool from a data analyst perspective. I think
So I'll talk a little bit. I'll give you some broad strokes first, and then we could maybe dive into some details. So with respect to NFTs, I think what's interesting with NFTs is a lot of the really interesting data actually doesn't live on chain. A lot of the metadata, even the asset itself, is actually stored in, for example, IPFS, or people will even leverage like conventional Web 2 resources, Google Cloud, AWS. And so the challenge really is not only is the metadata and the asset data off chain, a lot of the interesting sales information or the bids for NFT individual NFTs or elements of collections are all done off chain. And so our focus has been on serving up on-chain data, but we see the use case of NFTs. And so a pretty strategic decision was made. Okay, let's look at these massive NFT marketplaces. So, Blur, OpenSea, etc. And then we actually scrape that data as well, the off-chain data, and then stitch that together with the on-chain information that we have. And so you've kind of got this unified portal to be able to see, the contents that are on-chain. So being able to see the actual transactions that have happened. But, we've also got the underlying sales data. So, what are certain tokens listed for? And then, of course, we actually scrape and fetch the underlying metadata and the assets. So having that collective view allows you to then, not only see the historical transaction history, but also get a sense of where some of these collections are trending based on, what people might be bidding for certain NFTs. Oh, wow. So you have this whole marketplace element that you can actually build leveraging our API. And I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of this data actually doesn't even live on chain. It's manually scraped and then decoded by our team to be able to present it into sort of a meaningful format. So I think high level broad strokes, that's the conventional challenge that we face, especially with something like NFTs.
I think, fantastic answer. I don't think I could have gotten a better answer than this, mainly because, we're an exchange, obviously. We're in the business of curating liquidity, creating a product that allows people to swap one thing for another. But in the end, as a spot marketplace, hopefully in the future, a perpetual futures marketplace, the assets that we allow people to trade are fairly well understood. and most of the time highly liquid, especially in our case, right? When I think about NFT assets, obviously there's a whole world in NFTs, and quite honestly, I think our audience knows this pretty well. I'm one of the less informed people, but at least from a trading perspective, I always had a difficult time figuring out what liquidity means for an NFT, how to identify what marketplaces to look at for what collections, how to define what's trending, what's underpriced, what's overpriced, all that good stuff. And you just gave an answer to our audience saying that Covalent, having this data, essentially allows anybody to build a marketplace-like app, or I would rather call it a lens into the overall NFT market to understand trends, liquidity, pricing, etc. Right? And I think as developed as the NFT aspect of Web3 is, it's still far behind, exchange market-wise, etc. And something like Covalent can actually create an edge for somebody that's looking to trade or somebody that's looking to invest, because you can look at data and invest rather than just looking at the art or just looking at some characteristics, right? Very, very cool. What about...
That does fall into the cool stuff criteria in my mind too. So
100%, very cool stuff. Again, like, Web3 is very interesting. Web3 is born electronic, right? Versus Web2 or traditional financial markets, they're born from analog. There used to be trading pits. We had Steve Flanagan on the show. He was in the trading pits back in the 80s where he was like waving pieces of paper trying to do trading. You know what I'm saying? And crypto and Web3 started in a complete different manner. So I think the evolution here is going to be much different.
Definitely.
What about DEX data? You also mentioned DEX data. Do you have a cool answer for DEX data as well? What do you got? Hit us.
Yeah, so DEXs are a little bit better because obviously the swaps themselves are, they're recorded on chain. I think where it's interesting with the sort of plethora of different DEX types that you have available is, there is inherently like an infinite number of ways to record this information. And so the challenge that we've run into there is, how do you structure this data for an analyst to look at, whether it's, Curve, Compound, Yearn, or, Trader Joe, or whatever it might be. They can all effectively implement their own way of recording these information. And they also have their own unique elements to it. So in some cases, it's just a single pair. In some cases, it's multiple tokens that make up the underlying pool. And so to sort of look at this information and then structure it has been one of the key challenges that we've tried to address. Now, it started pretty simple, where we said, okay, Uniswap v2 had just launched, and then there are all these clones coming out. And so we said, okay, well, there's one standard that we can follow, because everybody's taking that open source code and just copying it and then pulling that into their respective ecosystems. But then you start to see, innovation and adaptation of that basic underlying AMM model to do all sorts of interesting things, with respect to, things like flash loan that you might see with Aave, or you've got these multi-token pools with all sorts of interesting curves, not just an XY equals K, which is sort of that constant product AMM model that Uniswap v2 uses. And so once we started to see the ecosystem evolve to sort of have these various DEX types, we thought, okay, well, we need to build more adaptable models internally, so that this data can be presented in sort of that same sort of structured approach that we've been akin to doing, but having the flexibility to show all these different variations that may exist with various DEXs. And that's been, I wouldn't say necessarily a fun problem, because it definitely has its challenges, but I think from the perspective of a user coming to our platform and using our API, it kind of gives them a sense that things are pretty consistent across the various DEXs that we support. So,
and just to clarify that exact point, Covalent will actually look at Curve data, normalize it, Uniswap data, normalize it, Dexalot data, hopefully normalize it, and provide it to the end user in a sort of unified manner, right?
That's right. So your shape is exactly the same. So you will see the same breakout for a particular pool on a DEX as you would with Dexalot or with Trader Joe or with any other DEX when you pull off from another chain.
Very funny story. I worked at a big bank a while ago. I had conversations with market data providers. You see, like Covalent started out, or at least from my understanding, started out as blockchain data provider. And banks, at least the business division that I was part of, was in the business of trading the assets. So the only data they cared about was market data, price data, volume data, etc. And all of the Web3 market data vendors, specifically, we had, at the time, we didn't know any better. We only looked at people who would provide price data. None of them, and this was a while ago, none of them were actually unifying the interfaces. Like I would have to build a consumer for one centralized exchange, then I would have to build another consumer for another one. And then there was no DEX data, right? The fact that you guys have this foresight and built it is amazing. Now, obviously, a few years later, I know better, but yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say one point on that. So what's interesting about DEX is with every swap, you effectively get the real-time price of that underlying of the pair. So if let's say you're trading, a lot with the USDC, for example, every swap that happens on a decentralized exchange is a price signal. It's a price point. And so we're basically looking at creating a model where we can take, weighted averages of these types of trades across a few different DEXs and ecosystems, and then create our own on-chain price feed mechanism. And so, a lot of the price feeds that people currently use today, is just off-chain sources from centralized exchanges. And so this has been an interesting sort of approach that we've taken to leverage on-chain DEX data to be able to create these custom price feeds. You can have it infinite set of price feeds essentially. The challenge, of course, becomes when you've got these very low liquidity pools and a trade maybe hasn't happened in like a month, and then you're serving up a price that looks quite outdated, but it is because it's there hasn't been very much activity. So those are the types of challenges that we're currently trying to figure out how we show that effectively.
Let me ask you if something is in scope, and essentially I would also be dropping some alpha, and people on the show love alpha. If hypothetically there was a product that would trade on the C chain simultaneously trading on the subnet, would Covalent actually put the two together and track that information, for example?
Yeah, so right now I would...
Or if the project wanted to work with Covalent, would that fall under that normalization process for that product?
Yeah, so we've got obviously support for the C chain, we got support for the Dexalot subnets, and then I think we've got 12 other subnets that we support now. And so effectively your response shapes would be identical. I think that the challenge bit would be, does the Dexalot subnet see the corresponding contract on the C chain that initiates that transaction, for example, if you're syncing it up between the two chains? If there is, then yes, we would have the ability to serve that up in a format where you could see activity happening in parallel. If there is sort of that discontinuity, you probably have to do a little bit manual work on the client side to be able to map that together.
Interesting. Okay. I think the answer there is if you have interesting data that your product is generating, Covalent actually has multiple options in place to make that available to the end users. And this was actually a hard case, in my opinion, for data indexing. Let me change a little bit. Let me change some gears, right? Moving away from individual products. Again, you're at this unique seat where you have the data, you have the ability to take a bird's eye view. What is your view into the L2 versus L1, and I'm even going to say versus subnet in the marketplace? Like, how do you see that battle, or how do you see that market share grab evolving? And do you have any interesting compare and contrast insights?
Oh man, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me
Firestorm living up to his name today, man. Just hitting us with heat.
I couldn't make the show a couple of weeks, and again, Covalent and data, those things I care about. So
So let's start with like the subnet approach, and I think the way the Avalanche ecosystem has sort of recognized the need for these application specific chains at sort of an early stage, and then built out the tooling that enables these app chains to sort of flourish. Um, is basically what's led to the subnet success. And we've seen that just based on how many subnets we have out there, meaningful subnets that are being leveraged by the ecosystem. And I think there's something to be said about having a dedicated blockchain for your application in terms of just all the benefits that you gain as an application, and then having sort of the parent provide elements of the security and just the consensus models and the broad sort of we call it the mothership support that's provided to the subnet. So I think Avalanche recognized this pretty early, and they've definitely got, I would say, a head start in building out that ecosystem and then seeing subnets gain traction. I think it's probably one of the more dynamic ecosystems out there in Web3 right now. With respect to like the roll up element, there's this kind of interesting battle happening right now. You've got Optimism, Arbitrum in the Ethereum ecosystem, and I think they both have done well in terms of demonstrating how something like the Ethereum ecosystem can scale with L2s. And then you've got these ZK rollups now popping up everywhere. In fact, when I attended a recent conference, it was like that was seen to be the only thing that that people were building. And so I think the jury's still out in terms of ZK rollups, and then what you have with Arbitrum and Optimism type of rollups. But it's very clear that L2s, ZK rollups, and then things like subnets are the way to scale these ecosystems and give applications exactly what they need to be able to grow. So I think what you'll see, and this is why we were talking about forecasting to potentially 300 at the end of this year and then 1,000 chains by the end of next year, is I don't think this sort of proliferation of app chains and then these rollups is going away. I think you're just going to see more and more projects sort of entering the space. And then, I think you'll get this same type of thing that you saw with the L1 boom over the past few years. You'll get a whole brush of different, types of, L2s that all sound very similar. And in terms of their tech, it's probably, maybe small differentiators. And then you'll get ones that sort of survive this next phase. And then you'll get the next wave of innovation building on top of both the underlying L1 and the L2. And I think that'll be sort of exciting to see those evolutions. So that's sort of how I see things evolving here.
So I guess from your perspective, you actually expect multiple different solutions to proliferate versus winner takes all, right? The reason why I sort of asked this as well is because, I've been looking at crypto Twitter for God knows how many years now, and the extreme tribalism, if you had no other view, ignore the data view for a second, you would think that it will be winner take all, because one guy says Ethereum, another guy says Avalanche, another guy says whatever, Polygon, Arbitrum, whatnot. But if you look at the data, which Covalent gives you, you actually see subnets launching, you see C-chain growing, you see Ethereum growing, you see Arbitrum growing, you see Optimism growing, you see Base growing, right? So, I just want to take this as we have a data expert. We actually have a person who has the data, who can give you the data, who says all of them are growing. It's like the joint mothership versus one battleship versus the other.
This is sourced and verifiable information is what we're trying to say to you guys.
Established by data, guys. No FUD here, okay?
One interesting trend I'll point out that we've started to see is, I think this is from that first wave of L1s, where we're only now starting to see some L1 projects sort of either pivot or sort of spin off into doing something completely different. Like it's now sort of affecting the L1s, where you're seeing these major projects and ecosystems sort of capture that lion's share of the developer and broad community. So those L1s are going to sort of pivot to something else, and so we'll see this next evolution with L2, and then these cycles will sort of continue. But what's interesting is we're only just starting to see this happening with at least the blockchains that we had supported for a couple of years now, and we're starting to see them moving into something else.
Very cool. Very cool. Let me ask you a little bit more about Covalent itself. On your webpage, I obviously looked at a bunch of stuff, but there is a mention of CQT network. Do you mind just giving us an overview of what it is, how it's used, why we should care about it, all that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Glad you asked that. I was actually going to bring that up in just a couple of moments here. So fundamentally, Covalent is a network. You've got data sources, blockchains, and then you've got your data sinks or distribution to the consumers of that data. And so that's through the API, that's through the Power or the BI tool that I mentioned, Increment. And those are all the use cases that we just talked about. And so fundamentally, the idea is for the Covalent network to be a decentralized public good. Like, there's really no reason for us to be the centralized entity sort of managing that entire process. It's very expensive for us to have to store all that data. It leads us to be a single point of failure. There's all the elements of the decentralized space that we can talk about that encourages us to move down that path, and that's effectively where we've gone with the CQT network. So the first phase was basically creating this patch on the node where effectively for any data that you pull from the blockchain, there's effectively this concept of like a checksum that gets applied to that block. And what it means is, this block has sort of been verified in terms of its underlying data. And here is sort of like our little hash or proof that we stamp on it, sort of saying that, okay, this has been pulled out in sort of this manner with this sort of underlying process. And so we applied this, and this is the patch that's being applied across a few different blockchain ecosystems. And then the network sort of released the second phase, which was this element of a refiner. And so what it means is you can effectively recreate each block, going back to the Genesis block, under leveraging this patch that we've built for both the block specimen, as it's called, that's extracted, and then the refinement method that's used on top of that data. And so where this is going to go to next is you're going to have validators in the network take care of things like the storage element, and then eventually the query element. So imagine this giant, effectively CDN network, where if you're fetching data for Dexalot, you'll get it from the closest source from where you're located. And the data that you get has sort of gone through this normalized process in accordance with the CQT network protocol that's been established for processing and structuring and normalizing that data. So that's effectively where CQT sort of fits in. And we've kind of gone through the first few phases. And I think the next phase coming up will be the element of storage and then the element of query fulfillment. And we're going to go down this path of gradually decentralizing the entire protocol.
Awesome, dude. Before I actually hand the reins over to Jimmy, one last question. For the Dexalot audience, what types of data or what types of use cases can they get access through Covalent for the data?
Yeah, so basically every swap that happens through Dexalot, you can check every balance for every address that's interacting with the Dexalot. You can get all the underlying sort of tokens. You can get their spot price when they were traded. So basically anything you'd want to know to build out a dashboard for Dexalot, you can access through our interfaces and through the API. And so if I can just share my screen here for just a quick second here.
Absolutely.
I'll just show you some pretty charts here. So.
Yeah, please.
Let's go. All about pretty charts.
We've seen cool stuff. We've seen pretty stuff. This is gonna be awesome.
Here we go. I'm just bringing this up. So here's an element. I think Firestorm, you probably saw this through the increment program, but this is effectively what we would teach the data alchemists to build. And so here, for the past quarter, what we've done is we've pulled out all the underlying transactions, all the balances for all the wallets that have interacted with Dexalot. And so you'll be able to create these types of charts where you can see everything from the block confirmation time, so at the block level, to the number of transactions and the throughput through Dexalot, to the number of active addresses. And all of these, you can effectively go download the corresponding CSV if you want to do some further analysis outside of this tool, for example, or even just go to the underlying SQL and then be able to modify this exactly as you would want your query to be. So this is an example of the type of tooling for analysts that is quite powerful, leveraging all the different types of underlying Dexalot data that I just mentioned.
So one cool idea that I'm just going to say, the dashboard you saw actually has everything available for an end user to think about what that growth of transactions look like and what that would translate in terms of a lot usage. And you would expect a chart similar to this. And then if you project that out, a few years down the line, you can draw some interesting conclusions. I have been looking at this on my own personally because I care about it. But anyways, I just wanted to...
Well, I mean, just even looking at the recent trends, this is just for the last quarter, but you start to see this growth over the summer, both in transaction count and number of active addresses on Dexalot.
And that's when the market is dead.
Yes,
not even there, right?
So just imagine the potential here as things pick up, and hopefully they do. I have no doubt that they will. It's just a matter of time. But yeah, really cool insights that you can gather from a tool like this, and then again having the ability to customize it to exactly the query that you want.
That is awesome, man. I remember when I first saw the Covalent data come through, like before we were in a partnership and an integration, and it was just like, man, I like to see those numbers go up. Those are good numbers. I remember sharing the data on our Twitter because I was like, wow, I really like those numbers. Harish, this has been awesome, man. We do have one question from the chat that I'd like to get to. Our guy Crypto Kindergarten looks like they've asked a question. Shout out to Crypto Kindergarten. What do you think the bottlenecks will be in the next 5 years as the space grows?
Hope this is not a biased answer, but access to data. And again, sort of tying in with exactly what Firestorm had brought up, like you've got these roll-ups, you've got all sorts of scaling solutions, application specific blockchains and subnets. All of this means just the volume of data, I think, is just going to explode. And even you take a look at the Ethereum ecosystem, where they've introduced an improvement, an EIP, to basically limit the amount of data that they're sort of going to be serving up, and have the full archival data offloaded to other third-party projects, essentially. And so what that means is the role that a player like Covalent will offer is, we're kind of like the Wayback Machine. If you need to go back in time and get a snapshot for every balance, see all the transactions, that's the role that we're going to play. And I think it's going to be a pretty exciting role, but it does mean, to that question, there's going to be a lot of scaling challenges that we're going to have to address, especially over the 5 years. That volume of data is going to explode, and to be able to get that in a timely manner, to get it in a scalable manner, and then distill it and have it structured, I think are all going to be fundamental changes. What's interesting, if you actually look at our unified API and you look at the endpoints, you'll see that they're labeled as version 2, version 3. And the reason for that is every time we build this endpoint, which is like a lens on a particular type of data, it really only works for 6 months to a year before we have to go back and re-engineer it for the growth that we've seen with that particular endpoint. And that's something that we fully expect to continue to do as you see these roll-ups and subnets evolution sort of take place. I think it's going to be pretty exciting, but also lots of fundamental challenges coming up ahead.
Totally.
Good luck and continued success to you, my friend. Looking forward to how Covalent grows.
Yes.
I'm only starting to go gray. I think I'm going to be fully gray in the next 5 years.
You're good.
That's
man.
what's going to happen.
Barely, if any. I'm completely gray, actually. So.
Yeah, you can't see the light hides my gray, so don't even worry about it. Before we let you go, Harish, I do, like we said, we're going to play some music at the tail end of the show. Got a song request for me? You don't have to think of it right now. You can send it to our producer before the end of the show. But if you got one right now, I'll take it because we always get a request. We're in the CLOB. It's a little thing we do. What are you thinking?
Well, then you have to play 50 Cents in the club, right? I mean, isn't that the theme here?
Actually, yeah.
By the way, that was my high school theme song, actually. So I'm probably dating myself, but that's.
Dude, I'm actually a 300-year-old vampire. Don't even worry about it, man. I'm older than everybody on the
I don't know what skin product you use, but you're looking pretty good.
Thanks, man. I'll let you know in the chat. But anyway, Harish, this was awesome. In case you guys didn't notice, I had to take off my hat because my brain grew from all the stuff I learned about Covalent. You can see it in his background, which I love, by the way. One unified API, 1 billion possibilities. Yo, guys, go check him out. Go check out all the data you can get from the subnet now. And Harish, we just want to thank you again for being on the show, man. This was awesome.
Jimmy, 2 times Firestorm is a pleasure.
Much appreciated.
We will definitely have you back.
Peace.
Looking forward to it.
Harish.